Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. This week, the race for a vaccine. There is probably no greater challenge facing humanity right now than finding a vaccine for Covid-19. But how do we pay for it? Who gets it? How do we ensure equal global access? The race for a vaccine is, of course, about the science, but it's also a question of economics. I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent.
And I'm Lizzy Burden, economics reporter at the Telegraph. We'll be your guides, and if you like what we're doing, please hit like, share and subscribe. Joining us today is Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Director of University College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and author of The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy. Welcome to CoronaNomics. First, I'd like to ask you, of all the huge problems that economics has sought to tackle during this pandemic, is finding a vaccine actually the biggest?
So it's one of the absolutely central aspects on the health side, as well as strengthening our global health systems. We are only as healthy with the coronavirus as our neighbor is, both on our street, our city, our nation, and globally. Had this crisis begun in Africa, where health systems are frankly much weaker than in China, we would all globally be worse off. So I think it's both on the preventative side in terms of getting strong global health systems, as well as ex post, absolutely a race towards a vaccine, but also governing that process in a way that really meets the public good and public interest test as opposed to private profit.
So first of all, I'd like to get into the practical issue about developing a vaccine. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has estimated that the full cost of a vaccine could be around $40 billion, or that's the amount of investment that will be needed to get one. But despite the fact that work on a vaccine began 6 months ago, governments around the world are still trying to raise funds to hit that goal. Yet, according to the IMF, global governments are taking emergency fiscal action this year worth $8 trillion, something you can see from this chart. Professor Mazzucato, are we, in your view, just trying to spend too little to get this vaccine out?
I think there's two questions: how much we're spending, and reflecting on the data that you showed before, surely we could be spending more. There is a money tree. We tend to throw money at problems when we actually see them as a problem. We never ask if there's enough tax revenue when we go to war. We just go to war. Whether we have realized just how important this coronavirus is in terms of really battling out with every policy tool we have, I think that is a question. However, given the money that is being put into the system, the bigger question is, are we governing that process properly? And just last week, the World Health Organization put out a very, very important policy proposal, which is really more voluntary. It's not mandatory, but it's all about having a pool of patents, actually pooling the patents, the knowledge, in order to really nurture the collective intelligence that we need globally in order to arrive to this vaccine quicker. So on the speed side, the more that science can really benefit from the learning from trial and error, and that knowledge being shared across countries. So to have a more collaborative and solidarity approach to this instead of a competitive one, the better. And that's where intellectual property rights really need to be structured properly in order to really stimulate innovation instead of just capturing monopoly profits.
Yeah, it's interesting you say we don't sort of penny pinch when we are in a war situation. In many ways, well, people have compared this to a war situation, a war against the virus, the war to keep us healthy. Why do you think that there isn't that kind of mentality of whatever it takes?
Well, again, I mean, there's different questions. One is the quantity of money. And I think if you look at the recent news in terms of how much Japan is spending on stimulating the economy, but also throwing money at the health side, the US, the UK, Europe, it's not so much currently, at least, about the money. It's also about what's been done in the past. So when we haven't been valuing our health services, that would be the National Health Service, for example, in the UK, if we haven't been structuring that service properly and, for example, privatizing or outsourcing too much of it, which also weakens the ability of the health service itself to manage a crisis, as well as so many doctors actually having left the health service. There was a whole strike of the junior doctors who felt that they were being forced to work overtime, and there was all sorts of work conditions over the last 2 or 3 years that really upset the health workers. It's sort of an insult now to simply be clapping them. So really, I think the lesson is, and again, it's a global lesson because we need global health systems to make us all resilient. We're only as healthy as our neighbor is, both the countries and on our streets, that we need to be, even once this crisis is over, and hopefully it will be soon, learning the lesson that these health services need to be well resourced, structured properly, given a remit that they are important. So literally valuing that work, paying for it properly, structuring that work in such a way that it attracts nurses and doctors who would see it as an honor to work for a well-resourced system, as opposed to one that's really, to be frank, a struggle to be working in today.
I mean, you touched on intellectual property. The French President Emmanuel Macron has said that any distributed vaccine won't belong to anybody. Is the vaccine simply too important to belong to any individual country or company?
Well, I think that's a fantastic objective. And I should say that France, in many ways, is providing leadership right now globally. It's not actually a coincidence that it's Macron right now who is saying this also for the vaccines. Now, the question of ownership, I mean, I do think that the question is more of governance. So it should be free at the point of use. Now, every country has a different type of health system, and it's a health system in the end that also subsidizes the cost of the vaccine. But there's also a point of negotiation between, say, the health service and the large pharmaceutical companies. And one of the biggest problems we've had in the health industry, so not just with vaccines, but really with many different medicines, is that the price of the drugs, of the medicines, do not actually reflect the collective risk-taking, the collective value creation. So just in the US, the United States, the National Institutes of Health spend $40 billion a year on health innovation, and then the taxpayer often cannot even pay for the drugs because of how they're priced. And so they're paying once, twice, or 3 different times if you look at their contribution to the value creation side as well. So really, this almost becomes a sandbox, this vaccine question, to much bigger lessons that we should be learning for the broader question around medicines.
But from the perspective of one of the businesses that's invested so much money in developing a vaccine like this, shouldn't they be able to make a profit?
Yeah, the question is not making a profit or not. It's, to what degree. So this should not be one of the most speculative sectors. Of course, they should make a profit, but how much is correct? Should they be making more profits than sectors which are producing things that you would not really consider human right? I personally think that a vaccine is a human right, and in that question, perhaps we could even say there shouldn't be a profit. But of course, pharmaceutical companies aren't just producing vaccines; they're producing different types of drugs, and you could look at the whole portfolio of different medicines they're producing and look at the profits averaged out across those. And you would expect the vaccines not to be the very profitable side. But even those other medicines, that was my point before. If you look at, for example, at Hep C drugs, the degree to which the industry was able to price the drugs for Hep C to an extent that really does not take into account at all that public contribution shows that there was a misgovernance. And really, that's the state's fault. We shouldn't, in some cases, blame the pharmaceutical companies for what they're allowed to get away with. But it's not just the prices. It's also, as we were saying before, the intellectual property rights. Patents are useful in some cases to stimulate innovation, but that's only if they're structured properly. If they are too upstream, so the research itself, the upstream research is patented. If they are too wide, used for strategic patenting. If they're too strong, so very hard to license, that actually simply leads to rent. William Baumol, a famous economist, used to talk about it as unproductive entrepreneurship, whereas what we want is productive entrepreneurship, which really stimulates innovation and science. And so governing the price system, governing the intellectual property rights and the sharing becomes something essential for states to do, not only for citizen needs, but also to get a public return for public investment.
Well, Donald Trump has said that the America First policy extends even to a vaccine. And we've got a clip here of Alok Sharma, the UK Business Secretary, at one of the Downing Street press conferences last month. He's talking about how the UK government's £130 million investment in Oxford University and Imperial College London's research should go.
If the vaccine is successful, AstraZeneca will work to make 30 million doses available by September for the UK, as part of an agreement to deliver 100 million doses in total. The UK will be first to get access.
Now, is that productive? What do you make of what he just said there?
Well, I mean, I think it would be unfair to expect a minister to say we're going to produce a vaccine and it's not for our citizens, it's for others. So this, the fact that they're spending the money on producing the vaccine, and two, thinking, and this is a critical point, it's not just science, but the manufacturing capacity, so to produce enough of it for all the citizens in a nation to be able to produce it, already that's an advancement. Unfortunately, sometimes we have the scientific progress and then we don't have the manufacturing and industrial capacity to make enough of something. We saw this, of course, with the personal protection equipment. There weren't enough masks. There weren't enough ventilators. So a country like the UK, which is so overly financialized, where we have also deindustrialized, we have lots of financial services, don't have a lot of industrial capacity, it becomes very hard to then transform our industrial capacity from making cars to making something that's required for this battle. The reason I give that example is that in World War II, there was, for example, in the US, a massive transformation of the automotive industry to then produce what was required for the war effort. And still today in the US, there's the Defense Production Act, for example, which was set up in 1950 during the Korean War, which gives the government the capacity to actually transform the factories and the industrial base to produce what's needed in a time of emergency. But it becomes really hard to transform a hedge fund into a ventilator. So that's a question that the UK does face. And that's why I think they're a bit kind of edgy about it. They're saying we're going to race to get the vaccine at Oxford, and then we're going to produce enough of it to give it to our citizens. Now, I think one question is, do they have that industrial capacity? I hope so. But then the next question is, once you have done that, how do you stimulate as much sharing and collaboration and, again, solidarity across the world? And by the way, there has been a lot of that during this crisis. I found it incredibly encouraging when the Chinese doctors flew over to Italy, where I'm from, to help out with the crisis over there, which, as you know, really got out of hand, even though the UK now has more deaths than Italy had. So that real kind of willingness to explore, to learn, and to share that learning, I think that has been part of this Corona story. Now, on the vaccine, it really becomes much more around this question of intellectual property rights. So as long as there is a patent pool and there's learning between countries, and then there's capacity within countries, then actually it can't be blocked off. If you have nations that can't produce it because they've lost industrial capacity and the patents are abused, then we have a huge problem.
Let's get into a bit more detail into that question of how this vaccine is distributed. So imagine we do get a vaccine, and imagine those intellectual property issues that you're talking about are settled. We can roll it out globally, but who should get it first? I mean, should it be certain countries? Should it be certain workers in those countries, healthcare workers, for example? How should an economist think about that really important question?
I mean, so I'm not an expert on vaccines. I mean, how I would see it, first of all, you would have to see this as a public good. And I would go even further to say it's a human right. Unfortunately, we don't have an economics of human rights. And even public goods, I've often argued, is sort of a limited concept in economics because it's not really seen as an objective. It's more a correction for what the private sector is not doing. So that's just one question. And the reason I talk about framing as an economist is it really is a lot of economic theory and framing, which then informs policy. So there's a feedback between theory and policy. We do need a new theory. And I do hope that with the coronavirus, we start thinking about an economics of human rights, because that would actually suggest that you want to do everything you can to make sure that vaccines are globally accessible and free at the point of use. Now, the problem there is not every country even has a proper public health system. This really goes to the root of things that are much more kind of on the base than the vaccine itself. So in countries where you have very little national health care, publicly funded, subsidized health care, in the same way that many countries don't have publicly funded education, so where the welfare state itself is weak, then the question you've just asked is much, much of a greater problem. So if you had strong, and I keep going back to this, strong global health systems and free public health care, so that healthcare itself does not become a speculative area like banking, then actually it's much easier. Now, the problem is some countries do have that. Of course, we know Scandinavia has, a stakeholder model of capitalism. In countries on the opposite extreme, where we've actually governed our businesses to maximize their shareholder value, and the welfare state itself has become weaker and weaker, it simply becomes much harder than to distribute public goods in a way that you're suggesting, which is to everyone, globally accessible and free at the point of use. So for me, the lesson is we really need to be reviving kind of that beverage moment of what we expect from a welfare state, but think of it globally. We are only as healthy as our neighboring countries are.
Yeah, and in terms of the distribution of global goods, as you put it, do we need institutions which are in charge of that? I mean, for you, is this something that the World Health Organization would naturally be qualified to do you think, to oversee?
Well, it would have to have more power. Much of what the World Health Organization does is give out recommendations. And even with this patent pool, it's simply a recommendation. And I would say we need to go further. I know it's hard, but we should go further. And that's why personally, I often talk about this. Again, resurrecting that term stakeholder capitalism as conditionality. So when you have an area like vaccines or health innovation in general, which receives so much, just, an extraordinary amount of money from not only the public sector, but also the nonprofit sector, then there should be conditions attached to how we then govern not just the patents, but again, the pricing of those goods. That would be very different for an area which really is truly 100% an outcome of individual entrepreneurship. It'd be very hard then for the state or an agency like the World Health Organization to demand or command companies to behave in a certain way. This is not the case with vaccine or antibiotics or the Hep C drugs. This is an area which, precisely because of that massive amount of public investment, really should have been from the beginning, and definitely now going forwards, governed in a way that actually gets that public return.
Thanks so much to our guest, Mariana Mazzucato, for appearing on CoronaNomics.
We'll be talking to many more top thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how we can weather the economic storm of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like, share and subscribe.
And if you'd like to get in touch, leave us a comment.
This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films.